Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is the US Futures Weekly Chart Analysis for the week ending 19th of June 2026. The first chart is the US dollar index futures, which responded quite positively and have done so over the last few weeks. Back here we saw the lows of this range tested, a push up to the highs of the range, 2 weeks of consolidation, a secondary push higher, a week of consolidation last week. There was some testing for supply below the previous bar's close early in the week, and then a serious push higher and above the highs of the range. This is a good, strong move for this market. I expect there'll be the inevitable supply drawn out in response to the push higher again this week, similar to what we saw in here and in here in response to the push higher. So you're likely to see some consolidation required in there next week. And if price is able to remain above the highs of the range, it would suggest this market really does have some underlying strength. A push back below that level would show uncertainty in the market. This is the E-mini S&P 500 index futures. This is this week's bar in here. This is some after hours trading. I'm not sure exactly how to get rid of that at this point in time. I'm relatively new to TradingView. But the market's responded quite positively this week to the push below the previous bar's close last week and the modest push higher later in the week, and the market's continued higher again this week. Volume did reduce to below the average, so there was no great intent being shown. The market's effectively floated higher on a lack of selling pressure to a large degree this week. You've really got the highs of the range on this bar here, which is the higher volume bar. This was a little bit fluffy up here, this very low volume. And you can see the market's closed at that important level this week. So there was no great intent being shown, particularly with the increased strength in the US dollar to a large degree, which makes it a bit more difficult in this market. But price has closed at the important level this week. I expect there'll be some testing for supply below the previous bar's close initially in here, and then a response depending on how much supply is actually drawn out and how the US dollar itself is trading. If it does pull back to consolidate and absorb supply, this market may attempt to push higher in response. US Treasury 10-year note futures. This is the bar we're looking at this week. It's the last weekly bar. And price is trading in a range at the moment. You can clearly see that in there, like that. The lows of the range were defended back here. And the market's holding on fairly comfortably at this level or at this point in time. Volumes have reduced to below the average over the last 3 weeks. So there's no serious intent being shown in the market. It's just trading sideways and waiting to see what's going to happen in the markets generally. It's still vulnerable, this close to the lows of the range down here, but at this point in time, the market's just trading sideways on low volumes without showing any great intent. Copper price futures. Copper price futures pulled back a little this week, mostly due to the strength in the US dollar, I expect. Price traded within the range of the previous bar for most of the week and remains above the highs of the range pretty comfortably. It's looking stronger than weaker here, attempting to absorb supply and in preparation for a push higher, I expect. When we've had this weakness more recently emerge, the market's comfortably absorbed the supply that's been drawn out in response, and it appears well placed to make an attempt to push higher when trading conditions are more favourable. Gold price futures. Gold price futures were in absorption mode for most of the week this week. This is last week's bar here, and price did trade a little higher earlier in the week and then faded lower towards the end of the week. In absorption mode, I expect. Price is trading adjacent to this period of consolidation in the background, and this week's bar did attempt to push above that level and briefly challenged this little minor level above. This is the market really trading in absorption mode right through there. And if that's successful, the market's likely to make an attempt to push higher at some point when trading conditions are more favourable. This market is affected greatly by changes in the US dollar. With the strength in the US dollar this week, it was very difficult for this market to push higher. So instead, the market has really consolidated sideways. There's been no great weakness, and that's a sign of strength itself, because it could have pulled back with the strength in the US dollar. It hasn't done so. If anything, it's attempted to push higher and then absorbed the supply drawn out. So it's really a timing thing here, more than any true weakness. This is silver price futures. Silver price futures continue to consolidate as well. This is the bar we're looking at here. The lows of the range come through there. The market did push higher and then faded lower to close back at the lows of the range. This was an absorption type move as well in response to the strength seen last week. This market's always a little more volatile than the gold market, or generally it is. And that was the case this week, with the market pushing higher and then pulling back and closing right at the important level. I expect there'll be an attempt to consolidate just below the previous bar's close early in the week, next week. If that's successful and supply isn't drawn out, I expect a recovery back into this level in here, where I expect the market will attempt to consolidate. This is light crude price futures. They've effectively broken down this week. This is the bar we're looking at. Here was the mini breakdown line in the background. Here, the lows of this bar. The price has broken down this week. We'll have to wait and see if the market's strong enough to recover back to this level, or whether the market's going to come all the way back to this level here. Spread did narrow somewhat compared to the previous bar, which does suggest that the market may attempt to come back and close somewhere around this level next week. Move into there like that, attempting to hold on. Whether it'll be successful or not, we'll have to wait and see. And I expect that the strength in the US dollar will make a big difference to the success or not of the push higher. If the US dollar does continue to push higher, I expect this market will certainly come back to this level. And if not, and the market goes into consolidation mode, it'll offer an opportunity for this market to push back above this line and attempt to consolidate there. Into the currencies now. This is the euro US dollar currency pair. And this market's attempting to hold on to the lows of the range here. This is the bar we're looking at here. And price has pulled back to this level. And I expect there'll be an attempt to consolidate sort of in here. Spread did increase considerably this week, mostly due to the strength in the US dollar, I expect. This market trades the inverse of the US dollar to a large degree, and not so much on European fundamentals, at least not so much as the strength and weakness in the US dollar itself. British pound currency futures, and they pulled back pretty seriously as well, similar to the euro, back to this level. Spread increased considerably, and I expect this market will attempt to consolidate at this level next week. It will depend to a large degree, similar to the euro, on the strength or weakness in the US dollar next week. I expect the US dollar will come back a little to consolidate next week. That'll offer the opportunity to this market just to recover a little of the lost ground this week, at least early in the week. Japanese yen currency futures, they're looking more and more weak. There's still a reluctance to move lower. Spread increased this week. The market really has started to break down again. It could have really stretched lower through here. It hasn't really done so at this point in time. It's reluctant to move lower, but the weakness continues to accumulate, and there's very little strength in this market whatsoever. It's just drifting lower under its own weight and really showing very little in the way of signs of strength whatsoever. Aussie dollar currency futures, they pushed lower this week as well, with the strength in the US dollar back to this level. The market's attempting to hold on in here, which is kind of what we said last week. The market would attempt to hold on there. There was a brief attempt to push higher above the previous bar's close, but that was short-lived. The market pulled back in response to the strength in the US dollar and is trying to hold on to this lows of the range here. If the US dollar does move into consolidation mode next week, I expect this market will push higher to some degree, probably up to the highs of this range in here. I don't expect it'll move much higher than that. And this is the likely level, at least in the near future, in here, between these two levels. I don't expect any great weakness in the US dollar, so I don't expect this market's going to accelerate higher. It's most likely going to consolidate to a large degree and attempt to hold on in the face of the strength in the US dollar. Bitcoin futures pushed higher earlier in the week and then faded lower towards the end of the week. This is last week's bar. You can see that it pushed higher and then faded lower. Between these two levels, there's not expected to be so much supply drawn out. I do expect the supply above will be from this level, the lows of that range, and higher. So the market was pretty easily able to push higher earlier this week and then fade lower. This is an absorption type pattern in buy the offer style. And I expect in response, at least early in the week, you'll get a little pullback like that to test the market for supply. If supply is found to be low, there'll be a secondary attempt later in the week to push higher. The real supply is from this level above, so the market can trade sideways in here and attempt to build up some strength. It doesn't really look like there's going to be a huge challenge to the lows of the range. It's certainly possible. At this point, it doesn't look too serious, but the market is likely to come back a little bit early below this week's close and just test the market for supply. If supply is found to be low, there's a good chance there'll be an attempt to push higher and recover that lost ground and perhaps issue a minor challenge to the lows of the range above. That remains to be seen. Just back to the US dollar index futures quickly. You can clearly see the strength over the last 6 weeks or so, with the strong push higher here, period of consolidation in response, secondary push higher, another period of consolidation in response, and this week a strong push higher and above the highs of this range. That's a pretty good move. Next level comes through here, and if the market can pull back and consolidate below the previous bar's close but above the highs of the range, that'll be a sign of strength for a secondary push higher again and up perhaps to the the highs of that range above. So we're expecting some consolidation in response next week, very similar to what we've seen in here and here. And I expect that'll happen again in here. And then there'll be a response depending on how much supply is drawn out and how strong the underlying market is. At this point in time, the underlying market is looking pretty strong. The close this week was a little off the week's high, but not excessively. And the market's certainly been showing intent over the last few weeks. And that's an intent to push higher with underlying strength in the market. Okay, thanks for your time. Back again next week. See ya.